Testing. This is a tape for Shawn Lamb after some discussion with her in the late spring of 1985 regarding the Nelson Brewery and my experience and relationship with it. I arrived after a phone call in the fall of 1935. We arrived in Nelson on the 5th day of January 1936. We landed down at the CPR station after a hectic train ride from Vancouver, after which at Penticton they took off the sleeping car and we had to get into the day coach. However, we were met at the station, taken up to the Hume Hotel, where we stayed for about 6 weeks. After the 6-week period estimated, we then went into the company house on the corner of Ward and Latimer Street across from the fire hall. One reason we didn't go in there earlier is that my predecessor, who was there at the time and living in the house, which was a company house, said that this young character, they're going to get rid of him in a couple of weeks, and asked me to come back. However, this did not happen. So we moved into the house about 6 weeks after arrival, which would be somewhere around the middle or so of February. I can remember that year very well because in the middle of February, the temperature got to 18 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. And I can tell you it was pretty cold. Everyone seemed to be skating on the lake and on the West Arm, as they called it, and they didn't seem to be suffering too much. But to us, coming from the milder climate, it was really a shock at that time. The last thing I want to do is ramble like someone who's, over 39 or something, but a couple of comments about the house. The living room, dining room area, which was very large and quite substantial, was papered with wallpaper with tulips on it, which were over 3.5 feet in height. And you can figure that red tulips on all that wall area was a bit of a problem. The kitchen was pretty obsolete. The whole house was obsolete. It was steam heated, however, from the brewery, which helped to offset the climatic conditions that existed at that time. We made several changes eventually through the cooperation of the management, or the administration, I guess you'd call it, of the brewery, and had more discreet wallpaper and painting jobs and so forth done in the house. I think that's all it's necessary to say about that at the present time. Now about the brewery plant proper. Of course, I immediately went over and took a tour around the plant to see what conditions were like. I can tell you some of them were really obsolete. And guess I could inject a comment here at this time. One of the reasons I came to Nelson was because in the phone call in the fall, and what I gathered later, the company was in trouble with the government, the Liquor Control Board, the public, and the hotel owners, who were all complaining about the quality of their product. And after walking around and looking at the plant, I can understand why they had problems. Now, to start from the plant, say from the brew house, as they called it, proper in those days, the brew kettle they had was a copper kettle, which was a nice, well-constructed kettle. Unfortunately, the rivets in the double bottom, which they used to steam heat and to boil the brew, was leaking and was contaminating the brewery, or the brew that was being boiled at that time. The mash tub, as they called it, and the cookers and these sort of things, they weren't in too bad shape. They were strictly old iron, but they could be coated and treated to not be a real liability. Eventually, to jump ahead of myself, the kettle we replaced with a boiling coil, which was done by one of the copper companies in Vancouver, and he also had a coppersmith come up and repair the leaks in the bottom to stop the contamination into the beer from the leaking steam bottom. The rest of the plant, starting from the mill where the barley malt had to be ground, was in pretty desperate shape. We did, however, buy a new 4-roller malt mill, which gave us much better, evenly ground barley malt and helped to increase the yield and cut down the overall cost and the waste that took place with this old crusher, which they had previously to this. The malt, I might say, arrived in carload lots of 40,000 pounds in 85-pound bags down at the CPR station, freight shed docks, and had to be hauled by our own trucks up the hill and then stored in a long warehouse where the sacks were just stored on the floor. This created another problem, as if there was leakage or split sacks. It had a tendency to attract mice. So this was another problem that we had to cope with, to make sure that there were no broken bags, no leaky grain, so that there would be no mice. I may tend to overemphasize the processing and so forth at this time, but I think that it's very important. It is a part of the whole process of the production of the beer in Nelson at that time. They had a refrigeration, which I will start on now, which used what they called direct expansion ammonia system, which was not flexible and was either too cold or nothing, and needed a lot of adjustments. After this brew was boiled, it was pumped up to a cooler and was cooled to temperatures desirable for adding yeast and for fermentation purposes. Now to backtrack a little bit, the cellars in the fermenting cellars and the storage cellars also were all cooled with this direct expansion ammonia system on the walls in the fermenting cellar, on the ceilings in the storage cellar. Once the ammonia was shut off or the compressors were stopped, the overhead pipes dripped, of course, all over the tanks in the storage cellars. Fortunately, the ones in the fermenting cellars dripped onto the floor, but temperature fluctuations were great. This was eliminated eventually by the building of a large brine, which we called a brine tank, which was a calcium chloride solution, which was able to be cooled to probably 10 or 15 degrees Fahrenheit and was circulated throughout the refrigeration system and gave you constant, steady flow of refrigeration according to the demands of the particular rooms or cellars where the refrigeration was being circulated. In the fermenting tanks also was a coil to control fermentation, through which this same cool brine was circulated, and once the temperatures had reached a certain degree, the brine coolers, the coils in the tanks were turned on, and the temperature was gradually reduced so that the yeast, which was fermenting the product, eventually all settled in the bottom of the tank. This was collected for succeeding brews and was very carefully inspected by microscope to make sure there were no foreign organisms or acetic acid or lactic acid or various other types of infection in the yeast, which was very prevalent in the brewery at that time due to the conditions of the plant. Now to review a little bit of what was done as far as the cellars and the plant were concerned. All walls and ceilings were all washed, scraped, and repainted. The outsides of the tanks were all scraped and painted, which had never been done before, and they were sort of an old battered up looking oak wood with no outside surface on it, and mold was quite prevalent to grow on the outsides of the tanks. It was also necessary to revarnish, as they called it, repaint the insides of all the tanks to keep the beer from soaking into the wood. This was done with an old-fashioned type of varnish, which was called brewer's varnish. Inside of a closed tank, the man who was applying it could only stay inside for 10 or 15 minutes because of the strong wood alcoholic smell that emanated from the varnish, and the tank had previously been heated, so the surface was warm. So it was these people who did the varnishing were watched very carefully and dragged out through the manhole, or came out through the manhole voluntarily after a few minutes, and another one went in and finished the job. Later on, I was able to obtain another type of wax coating to coat the insides of these tanks, which had very little odor and was certainly a lot easier to apply and did an excellent job on the insides of the tanks. Just an offhand comment today with the modern breweries that we see around the country. They are large stainless steel tanks with automatic pressure cleaning devices in them, and it's a far cry from the old wooden tanks that was in Nelson in those days. The other thing about some of the Nelson tanks, they were oval-shaped oak stave tanks. Oak staves about 4 to 5 inches thick, with a very small manhole with a crossbar on a door that pulled in and was cinched up with a bolt and a crossbar. And the manhole itself was no more than about 16 inches in height and about 8 inches in width, and was very, difficult to crawl in and out. If you were a big man, you couldn't get in or out of these tanks. One of the strange things about it was that these tanks had a sloping edge on the manhole, which was pulled into place with the crossbar, but was sealed with beef tallow of all things, which was a beautiful source of infection and molds. So we did, however, get away from that by cutting holes in the face of the tank and installing iron doors, larger and with just rubber gaskets or rubber seals. In those days, beer was aged much longer than it is today, and we needed additional storage. The brewery had endeavored to build another cellar down underground at the back end of the existing plant, but it had a couple of cave-ins, landslides into the cellar, and they ended up eventually with a huge concrete wall and ceiling, concrete wall about 6 feet thick at the bottom and 3 feet at the top, to hold up the lane and the soil and the gravel and the dirt that wanted to push this wall out. On investigation, however, we found out that the old creek called, I think, Ward Creek ran down through there, and here they were trying to build a cellar or concrete wall in an area where the Wall Creek or the Ward Creek had gone underground, and still was a powerful factor. However, they did beat it by diverting eventually the water and graveling and filling in behind the concrete wall, and eventually got it finished after I got there. And we were able to get some additional storage tanks, which were badly needed. I might say, too, that the storage tanks in those days were just wood with iron hoops around them with locks and nuts and bolts. Nothing like the stainless steel or aluminum or tanks, or which are prevalent today in the brewing industry. An interesting factor to note, too, that in this diversion of this creek and the building of the concrete wall and the establishment of this cellar eventually, that Tom Waters, who eventually became mayor of Nelson for a period, was the contractor. Not sure that I mentioned earlier that as we were painting out all the walls, the ceilings, we also painted all the tanks white and made the place look a lot more respectable. The rubber hoses that were there, a lot of them were cracked, spoiled. The rubber lining was shot, and they were all replaced. We also put additional pipelines, copper or stainless steel, which was hard to obtain those days, pipelines to connect different areas rather than using rubber hoses, which had to be sterilized and kept clean and watched very carefully. In the old days, beer was not carbonated as it is today, and we had to buy then carbonators and transfer pumps and tanks that would hold pressure, so that when kegs were filled or where bottles were filled, they would be filled with beer of a certain gas content and not flat or losing gas in the process. This was one of the things we did with carbonators, transfer pumps, and I think we had a couple of glass-lined tanks eventually, glass-lined steel tanks, which we were able to obtain second-hand from some place or another to use for bottling, so that the beer that was bottled, whether it's 100 barrels or whatever it was, had a uniform carbonation all the way through and was not leaking pressure as wood tanks tend to do. When I arrived in Nelson, one of the processes that they were doing at that time was to use artificial CO2 gas, which was bought in drums and was injected in the beer through what they called a carbonating stone, which hung into the tank. So I eventually persuaded the powers that be that we should have some tanks, a closed pressure fermenting tanks, from which we collected the gas that was fermented and run through a purifying system and stored and was used, which we call the natural gas, was used for carbonating the product, which made a great improvement in flavor and quality of the beer. We also in those days had all wooden kegs, and we had a cooper, an Austrian fellow who was a really trained cooper, who could make wood kegs and wood tanks not leak and this sort of thing, look after the kegs and repair them. They also had to be sprayed on the inside with a pitchy compound, which was burned out periodically and sprayed again on the inside of the wooden kegs. This kept them from leaking, kept the inside of the kegs sterile so that the beer did not get contaminated while sitting around in kegs. The bottle shop was so-so, and bottled something like 50 bottles a minute. Later on, we were able to buy some new equipment, so forth, for the bottle shop, and a new proper pasteurizer, which gave us about 160 bottles a minute, which was something in those days for a small plant. We also converted our steam boilers. I'm just sort of rambling now. We converted our steam boiler system, which was a small 60 or 80 horsepower steam boiler, which was fired with 4-foot lengths of cordwood, and the steam pressure fluctuated according to how fast or how quickly the fireman was able to throw the wood into the fire and generate the steam. Eventually we were able to pick up another boiler which had been used by a sawmill somewhere and then ditched, which gave us something like 160 horsepower. And we bought automatic stokers for coal, and bought coal by the carload, or by the barge, by the carload, and used a coal-fired boiler. This gave us a much more even steam distribution, and when we wanted steam for processing, wherever we wanted it, it was available. I can remember when I first started up in the brew house, trying to heat up the mash, the cookers and so forth, that the engineer used to run up at 5 o'clock in the morning and say, I haven't got any steam, you're using it all up. And this is a situation that we eventually overcame with the steam and the coal. We had a surplus of steam during certain periods of time after that, which we sold to Grizel greenhouses, which were immediately behind us, put a pipeline in under the alley, and they drew steam from the boilers during slack periods of time, for which I think they paid something like $500 a year, which was thought to be, a pretty good price in those days. While I'm talking about this, I mentioned earlier that we converted to coal. We bought coal in by the carload, I think it was, open cars, and was hauled up to the brewery by the West Transfer Company. They had 2 horses and sort of a dump cart in which they loaded the coal and hauled it up and opened the bottom of the truck, of the wagon, and dumped the coal into piles. One year we had a problem in the plant. One winter about that time, we had a problem in which a whole tank full of water was shot out through a grain chute into the street and overflowed the sewer and ran down Latimer Street into the car tracks, all the way down Stanley Street, down to the bottom, Stanley and Baker, and it froze as it went down the rails, and the streetcars had a terrible time getting up the hill. Then a half an hour or so later, a man turns up who was the city engineer, a man by the name of Russell Potter, and who retired in Victoria, and whom I have seen off and on at various times, and who has taken up painting as a hobby. But he came up anyway and was really disturbed because we ran all the water down the street and froze up all the car tracks, and the streetcars, in spite of their sanding equipment, couldn't get up the hill. So that was my first introduction to Russ Potter and the city engineering department. I don't know how interesting these little side items are, but we paid duty on a gallonage basis for beer to the excise department, and we entered in our excise book X number of pounds of this and that, malt and hops, etc. And we were supposed to produce X number of gallons. I can remember once in the middle of the night getting a call about 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, that the man who was operating the machine at that time had forgotten to close the door which ejected the used mash out of the mash tub down to a chute down to the dairy farm truck which was supposed to be parked there. And of course there was nothing there, and it all went down into the drain and flowed over onto the street. So I had to square ourselves with the excise department and prove to them that this stuff had been lost and that we hadn't pulled a phony on them and so forth. A couple of the excise officers we had to deal with in those days was Bill Young, who was the collector of customs for Nelson, and a man by the name of Martin Robichaud, who retired also in Victoria, and who I used to see periodically around some of the shopping centers here. Previous to that, there was a man by the name of Jack Bunyan. I think perhaps we're getting a little out of focus here, or out of order, but thinking about what has been said, I think that we have never mentioned the fact, while we did talk about the malt and the grinding of the malt, we have never mentioned the hops. We used to buy hops mostly from British Columbia, but we also bought some hops from Czechoslovakia, which used to arrive in huge bales weighing about 500 pounds. These bales had a linen lining up against the hops, plus a burlap on the outside. And the linen was something that was collected and was made into tablecloths and serviettes and various other things like that. But they were a smaller hop with a more delicate flavor, which we used to blend with the British Columbia hops, which were a little stronger flavored. One of the men who was taking the hops out of the bale, the BC hops, to put them into the barrels for use in the particular brew, came across an Indian silver ring, which was lost by one of the Indians who used to pick hops. The hop picking business in the fall was quite an interesting project that the Indians all through the Fraser Valley and that area down into Vancouver used to come up and pick hops. So the hop during that period for a little extra income. I presume one of them lost their Indian silver ring in the hops, and as far as I know, was never recovered, and was kept by the man by the name of Maglio, Tony Maglio, who kept the ring and wore it for a long time after that. I think I should say something about the trail plant at this time. I've talked all about the problems and so forth in Nelson. Trail plant was used to produce a limited amount of keg beer, draft beer as we called it, and we made about one brew every 2 weeks. I used to leave Nelson late afternoon, drive to Trail, get into the hotel, get up and out in the morning to run these brews through the Trail plant. There were staff there that carried on and fermented the beer and pumped it and filtered it and so forth after that. and I went over periodically to review and see what they were doing. It was not in quite as bad a shape as a Nelson Brewery, because A, it was not being used as often and had not been run down the way that the Nelson plant was. We had a man in Trail at that time who was supposed to be my assistant, and who I think we were talking about on the other side of the tape about the man in Trail who we had to fire, and of course all the high-priced help we had around in those days. And Nelson said, "Oh no, John, it's your problem. You go and get rid of them," which I had to do. It wasn't a very pleasant expedition, if you like to call it that. The man in question was considerably older than I am. He was partly crippled and had come from Winnipeg to Trail to take this job, and stayed on around Trail for some time, and I don't know eventually whatever happened to him. But it was one of the unpleasant things that one is forced to do in the business or economic world today. I think maybe we should talk now about some of the more pleasant things that I started reading in various publications about awards being made to Canadian breweries for quality products and products that met certain standards. And I thought, well, why can't we do it? So I got busy and developed various types of brews, something akin to the European types, something akin to the American types, and something akin to the Eastern Canadian types, which more or less match the American types. So eventually we came up with a Columbia, which won, I think, the Cross of Honor. We came up with a real ale, Kootenay Pale Ale, which won an award. And I think Rainbow was the third one, which won an award over a period of a couple of years. So we were delighted about this. And I have enclosed in this package the Cross of Honor and the Star of Excellence for your record or for your displays in the museum as you may see fit. There are also some letters from various sources of congratulations, which you may be able to use, or at least you could file away somewhere in a filing cabinet for future reference if they should be required. And to divert a little bit, I might say that the Rainbow beer that was a prize winner was a partial rice and malt beer, which was not too common in those days. The Kootenay Pale Ale was an ale which was made with a top fermenting yeast, which is a real ale, as we call it, and it required certain controls so that there was no contamination of the beer yeast from the ale yeast or the ale yeast from the beer yeast. I think the rest is more or less history, that I became involved in community affairs to try and make sure that the Kootenay Breweries Limited was well represented. I was mixed up in the Chamber of Commerce Industrial Committee. I was president of the Nelson Rotary Club 1946-1947. We were instrumental, both my wife and I, in the development of the Navy League. She was mixed up in the art world and the development of arts and the display of art, objects and pictures in various places in Nelson at that time. During this period, our sales had gone up about 400% from what they were when I first went to the Kootenays. And while unbeknown to me, certain people, promoters in Alberta and Vancouver were looking at Kootenay and Fernie Breweries, figuring this was a good place for an amalgamation, to which I totally agreed, and I had said for some time that we should take Cranbrook and Fernie under our wings and do something with them. However, we had some supposedly high-priced promoters get into the picture and develop the four interior breweries, which was Nelson, Trail, Cranbrook, and Fernie, into one unit. I spent 6 months in Fernie fighting the coal miners' unions and all these people who thought that Fernie was the only place in the world and nobody else had anything or meant anything. I will say that when I left Fernie, the union was very kind to me. They took up a collection, or they got into their funds and bought me a nice traveling suitcase. I guess they thought if we get him a traveling suitcase to get out of here, he probably won't be back. There's much more I could add, but I don't think it would mean anything to you people, or I don't think it would mean anything to the historians. Eventually, as you may or may not know, the amalgamation of these Nelson, Fernie, Cranbrook, and Trail plants took place and established a brewery in Creston. I went over there for 2 years, and that was all I could take, and then left and went back to Victoria and went to work for the Provincial Government. Now, if there is anything else or any other particular point historically that you might want information about, let me know and I'll see if I can dig it up. But off the top of my head at the present time, I tried to give you just a very varied outline and trying to eliminate the personal participation as much as possible. We have, as you know, many awards, copies of which I have enclosed for you. I have given you the Cross of Honor, the Star of Excellence, and copies of letters from people congratulating Interior or Kootenay Breweries on their awards. Also a copy of the safety chart showing the safety record of Kootenay and Trail and various Cranbrook and Fernie breweries, just for the record. There is so much more to be said, but it is sort of personal data, and I don't feel that it should be included in sort of a history about the brewery itself proper. When I look at the building today and the condition it's in, I'll tell you, my heart bleeds. But however, this is life, and this is the way it is, and there's just no way that a brewery would ever be reestablished in Nelson under the present circumstances. The only possibility would be one of these cottage breweries, which we have in Victoria and Sydney and a couple in Vancouver, which produce a limited amount of draft beer. I sat at a meeting on, Thursday, with a man from Ottawa. His son is now importing European beer in kegs for distribution throughout parts of Ottawa. So it's interesting the way things develop. I might say that in the pictures, I've tried to put a short explanation on the back, but there is one picture there which shows some metal or aluminum kegs, which were some of the earliest kegs ever bought, metal kegs ever bought by Western breweries at that time. There were some in Vancouver and a few in Victoria, but Kootenay Breweries was well up there, and we were able to purchase a couple of hundred of aluminum kegs at the time. One of the problems was that they contained a quarter of a gallon or something more than the 12.5 gallons they were supposed to contain, and it developed into a problem with the excise department on a gallonage and sales tax basis. One other thing I would say at this time is that every time we successfully completed a project, we had a little ditty which we sang among ourselves. And it's very appropriate today because Kansas City is one of the finals in the World Series Baseball League, that everything's up to date in Kootenay Breweries. I said earlier that we were just sort of jumping around from thing to thing and place to place, things and events that sort of came back to me and as we carried on. One of the important things was we put a very deep well on the land to use for refrigeration cooling. With the expansion of the plant and the extra space that needed refrigeration, we had to buy extra compressors and condensers, and it required a lot more water for cooling. Later on, in these same cellars, we put in individual coolers for each room using the refrigerated brine circulation, and it made quite a difference and gave you a very even, controlled temperature. Sum up, I should say that after all these improvements and changes had been made, our product was acceptable, that we had very little trouble from outside with any of our customers, that our sales increased about 400%, and it was very successful and created a lot better feeling for owners and employees and the general public that we were in contact with. One or two more rambling thoughts. The brewery was paying dividends of about 14% to the shareholders who lived in the Nelson and Trail area. There were several widows who were saying that this was their main source of income, and they were very happy to receive the rate of interest that they were receiving on those shares at that time. If you hear the telephone ringing on the tape here, I was doing this recording when the telephone did ring, and I got back to the tape recorder and was running it. I did hear the telephone ringing, so I don't think it will bother anyone. One or two more incidents. We built a huge coal storage bin at the alley at the back of the plant, which sloped down to the engine room and fed the coal right in front of the steam boilers. During one period, there was a great shortage of bottles for bottling, and we bought several carloads of used bottles from Spokane so we could stay in business. And there were a lot of quart bottles in those shipments, which we stopped using about that time. And they were left over around the plant there. And I often wondered what has happened to them. This tape was made without notes, just from memory, and it may be a little out of order, but there are one or two grammatical errors I noticed when I reran it. But rather than try to blank them out, I'm just going to leave it as it is. And if someone types a manuscript or anything from this tape, we presume that they will change the couple of wases to wers and whiches to whos and so forth. And I say thank you. I can't think of anything else. I have rather enjoyed reminiscing and putting it on tape at this time, and thinking of things that have happened. There are so many other little incidents that could be added, but it would go on and on for a long, long time and may not prove any value from the museum standpoint. To you, Shawn, and to any of the volunteers or the staff of the museum, best wishes and hope that things continue to prosper with you in the museum. And we both send our best personal regards to anyone who may be listening to this tape. Good night.